And welcome back, everyone. We trust that you have enjoyed the break. Welcome back to those of you that are here in person, to those of you logging in online, and of course to those of you joining us from one of the global studios. So this next session is all about catalyzing private finance for circularity in Africa. Now, of course, when we talk about circularity, the circular economy, we can't do so without talking about the frameworks and the mechanisms that govern our society, our world. And of course, finance, money, plays an important role in that. In this session, we're going to be talking about how we can mobilize private funds towards investment in projects, programs, and businesses that have to do with circularity. We're going to investigate how startups, entrepreneurs can make sure that they receive the funding that they so desperately need. Now, to moderate this session, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing the person who's going to be doing that. So he is the director and global head of Dalberg Implement. He leads the new and rapidly growing Dalberg Implement business based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And his work mostly involves leading teams that drive systems change by embedding in client spaces, and that's including government, donors, funders, and private sector actors. He has led the establishment of several project management offices and delivery units across the continent and has hosted these in a multitude of countries in Africa. He's part of the team that serves as the Secretariat for the Alliance for African Circular Economy. Our next moderator is Steve Kisaki. Please give him a round of applause as he comes to stage.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Gosh, the tea break was so long and we all forgot that we're back. So we're going to have a fantastic session and we're going to talk about money. And I feel like this room, we're all charged up to understand how do we finance all the work that we've been speaking about yesterday and a bit about today as well. Great phenomenon around circularity and circular economy, but how do we get the money to get it done? Now, the session that we're going to get through is pretty interesting, so I won't take anyone's thunder by trying to explain how much we'll get through. But to set the stage for us, I would love to introduce Madame Aissa Torre, who's the country manager for AFDB in Rwanda, to give us a bit of remarks, please come up on stage, about, circular economy and financing. And how do we see it? And give us a bit of guidance in terms of how we take this session forward. Most welcome.
Thank you so much. Distinguished delegates, Muramutse, bonjour, good morning. Thank you for inviting the African Development Bank to give opening remarks at this very important session to discuss private sector engagement on financing circular economy. We, as a bank, the Bank of Africa, we certainly have a lot to say about financing for development and in particular how to incentivize private sector. The World Economic Forum estimates global business opportunities in the circular economy at $4.5 trillion, yes, $4.5 trillion by 2030. We also heard yesterday at this forum how investment in companies and ecosystems working on circular economies solutions have opportunities to drive whole of society transformation and innovations. Africa's future economic growth and the prosperity of its people are ultimately linked to a successful transition to a green and resilient economy. In Rwanda alone, the government's National Strategy for Transformation 1 estimates that circular economy requires over 440 million investment between 2018 and 2024 in various recycling and sustainable management activities. These are all opportunities for private sector to go green and to make profit. However, we also know that private sector can be risk averse and needs some guarantee. Even if the world has seen an increase in debt and equity investment and instruments on nature-based investment and climate finance globally, the financial markets on the continents and the financing vehicles that are available are not yet able to channel the funding to circular businesses, at least at the scale and scope that is expected, and venture, and would need to in order to scale the transition. There are many reasons for it, for this situation, and we all know what these reasons are, including high financial costs, high collateral requirements, limited green finance experience of business startups, existing local financing capacities, which is very, very low, and the fact that I said it, private sector needs some assurance of where they are putting their investment. Especially the challenge in many circular startups and new businesses on the African continent is how to get on the first step of the financing ladder and development, and to develop a bankable venture to attract capital for early-stage financing. Even for mature businesses and large-scale enterprises, they also face challenges in preparing projects that prove the impact of their investment on climate, nature, on our planet, to obtain credits and financing needs for the circular transformation. The risk premium, as you know, are very high and come with huge interest rates. The challenge we are going to discuss today is how to reduce real and perceived risk for private capital to flow to circular economy ventures. African Development Banks, in its Climate Change and Green Growth Strategy 2021-2025, has committed to have over 40% of its approved projects to be climate-proof and to double its commitment to climate finance to $25 billion by 2025. And we are in good track for that. The bank has put several de-risking financial instruments, including technical assistance grant through the African Circular Economic Facility, ASEF, and we also manage at the bank level the African Water Facility, the Clean Dev African Fund, and many more. Recently, last year, we have set up the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, CEFA, and also the Africa Climate Change Funds to support or to bring the climate finance at a higher scale. We therefore hope that this discussion today will take place should help to structure all global financing structure to be able to meet the needs for circular economy. The bank understands that locally based green banks are powerful tools to address market needs and to understand local risks and drive private sector investment in a higher and better way. This is why in Rwanda, African Development Bank and Banque de Développement du Rwanda and FONERWA are currently leveraging with the Green Climate Fund over $40 million to supplement IREME Invest that has been successfully launched at a COP 2 or 3 weeks ago. It is my firm belief that the expertise dialogue we're having today will enable all of us and the industry in general to get better solutions so that the circular economy can be a complementary force in building green resilience economies in Africa. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Musa Kwelchana.
Thanks so much, Madam Isa. Thanks so much, Madam Isa. And I think one of the key takeaways among many is how we bring together all the financing instruments to work together. At this point in time, there's been quite a lot within the grant system, but can only get us so far. And like Madam Isa said, how do we use this session to start bringing together ideas that can actually get and harness all these financing instruments. Now, one key instrument actually is, or one key source of financing is the private sector. And GIZ has just completed a study that I would like to show you in a video for 2 minutes, and here it comes. All right. So we now move to the next segment, which is a panel conversation on how we unplug financing for circular economy in Africa. I would like to call up our panelists for this session, Ada, Abel, Jonathan, and Cohen. Please come up. All right. Welcome to the panel. I'll do a quick intro of our panelists. So starting to my immediate left, Ada, who comes from ASEN, and she's the Director of Partnerships. Abel, who's the Associate Investment Director at Novastar. Jonathan, who's the Managing Partner of Office Lord Consulting Services. And Cohen, who's with the ASEN Foundation and also the CEO of Trinomics. Welcome, everyone. So to get us started, I think, Ada, I would love to hear your reflections and a bit about coming from the work that you do. What have you actually seen in failed investments, and what are the common denominators that you actually see in that space?
Yes, thank you. So a bit about AECF. We are development finance, African-owned, African-grown organization that invests in early stage, high-risk businesses that contribute to climate resilience, including in fragile countries and with a focus on gender lens. So you can see me coming with all the boxes for very high risks, pioneering type investments. We'll have a lot of failures. And it's our mandate. It's part of what we do. We launch challenge funds to source solutions from the private sector, small and growing businesses, to tricky, hairy problems. And we help them test, iterate their business model, and we help them be investment ready for those guys that come after us. Early stage, but commercial capital. So we fail so that they can succeed, and it's a very needed space that we evolve in. We have invested in over 33 businesses that adopt circular economy principles as a fundamental principles within their business models. So not just as a side hustle, but as a core business design. And from all sorts of circular businesses, soil to energy, waste to food, waste to pharmaceutical, waste to garment, clothing, construction material, alternative feedstocks, you name it. We've seen a lot of very high failure rate, especially in those businesses. I think a few learnings for us is those businesses, particularly because their business model is often very complex, very much at the crossroad between different sectors, and very vulnerable to ups and downs in logistics, transport, getting access to the inputs in a consistent manner. But also they produce alternative products to mainstream products in very different value chains, and each one has its own delivery model, customer segment, price points, and route to market. So us as an investor, giving money, investing grants or refundable capital was not good enough. And it was actually not a good starting point. And so we now have shifted our model whereby we start with investing technical assistance, BDS support, strategic connection, market leakages, and financing per milestone. So we walk the journey through with those entrepreneurs. We've also had to curate our ticket sizes and the way we design our interventions in the different countries and market maturity level. We've had to work really extra hard in fragile contexts to build resilience to things that are completely out of reach of businesses but that dramatically affect them, like forex risk or inconsistent fiscal regimes, ethics prioritization. And I think what I want to say on financing those businesses particularly is that when successful, they have a very big potential to build resilience in local economies. They provide alternatives to very often imported goods that are locally sourced. And they provide fossil fuel-free alternatives that also looks good on the balance sheet of most African countries that use a lot of their hard currency to import fossil fuel or fossil-based products. So it also has a beneficial macroeconomic impact. So I think investors in the room should also look at this more macro-level impact and how those businesses have the potential to support the government priorities.
Okay. Thanks, Ada. Jonathan, I want to move to you, and I'm sure there's a number of entrepreneurs in the room, online, on the studios as well. Want to tap into financing, be it climate, green, traditional financiers. What's your advice to them? And I know you do teach this as well in Nigeria, so it would be great to also hear from you from that perspective.
All right, thanks. I wanted to sort of make two distinctions. So there's the secular finance, which we speak to the financial products, and we've highlighted a couple of financial products, whether it's green bonds or some of the climate-related funding you're speaking about. Then there's also financing circularity, which then speaks about all the requirements to access finance. So what I would say is, just like with everything that requires finance, finance is not an emotional thing, right? It flows in the direction of value. So what I would say to entrepreneurs who are trying to access finance, especially secular-related finance, will be to be able to tell the story around how value is created within their businesses. So some of the things that I'll be speaking to, so for example, how we look at some of their financial valuations or their financial stories with their financial statements. There are a couple of things there that where the story around how value is being created from a secular perspective might be lost. So for example, if you think about a business that does a lot of recycling, right, might tell its story being very asset light. But essentially, there's a lot of known assets that are in there where there's actually value in that. One of the things, again, I also like to speak to around accessing finance also will be from the parts of the practitioners. So if I speak about the banks, one of the things I like to speak about is the banks have to be secular as well, too. So how many funders do you find sharing a secular story as well, too? There will obviously be the role around policies as well. But I think for me, in trying to access finance, is clarity around where value is created within the business. And that can speak to things around the reporting, that can speak to things around how our business value is being communicated. I think once we are clear on that, something interesting from a research I've been involved in is that there's actually been a lot of businesses that are secular, but have also been accessing funding, even without the thematic focus on circular economy finance. And what is it that they do that is very successful is that they're able to tell the story, to where the value that it creates. And also when we speak about entrepreneurs, there are several classes of entrepreneurs. So am I speaking to a startup or are we speaking to a small SMEs at the growth stage? Because a startup might be more attracted to grants, right? And then we have to then speak around what available grant mechanisms are out there. But if it's for a business that is already in operations, maybe growing, I actually even do think that there's quite a lot of opportunities to unlock circular funding. So take, for instance, partnerships with some of their recycled products. That way they can unlock some sort of funding for those businesses. But for me, the key thing is if you tell the story, and that's why data and measurement is very important for any business that is circularly inclined. If you can tell the story around where your circular impacts are, I think any funder, regardless of which funding organization, will be attracted to listening to you and providing you with some sort of finance.
Okay. I would like to come back to that at some point in terms of how do you even read the room to tell the story? Because I feel like it's a different story that you tell different people. I was speaking to an entrepreneur this morning, and he basically said the same, that he has to actually script his story very differently depending on which room he's going into. So we'd love to hear that in terms of how do you also read the room. But Cohen, moving to you, and probably in keeping also in terms of accessing financing, how do you improve investment flows in circular economy businesses?
Yeah. So thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. So I want to keep it rather short with two main messages. So first of all, within the African Circular Economy Network, we have hundreds of experts with small businesses. And we see that they are struggling with many issues regarding finance, but also related to admin-related issues. So, and that's my first message. When you see that people are setting up a project, it always takes a lot of time before they're arriving at the financial closure. And often, they don't reach even that point due to many issues. And often, there is a lack of finance until that point that they arrive at financial closure. We know that and it's not only in Africa, so it's worldwide, that due to permitting-related issues, administrative-related issues, and so on, that it can take 5 to 10 years until you arrive at financial closure. I think that's really a key message to many MDBs, investors, donors, and so on, to think about it. And the second message is directly related to the fact that when you do set up a project and you look at your business case, and that's a message to governments worldwide, there is currently not enough attention for the demand of your circular economy project, your product, your sustainable product, which means that they often have to compete with fossil fuel-related products. And they are often in competitive disadvantage. So my message here is regulatory frameworks are so important to make this happening, so that they have to take care of a level playing field. I think these are the most important two messages that I want to give.
Perfect. Thanks, Gwen. And just to flag to the audience, right after my next question to Abel, I'll open it up to you if you have any questions for our panelists, because I know you probably also would love to hear more in a different angle as well. But Abel, you have made some successful investments. And hearing all this, at least from Ada in terms of what has failed, and probably what she thinks can be done better, and probably down the line as well in terms of what are those conditions that should be in place. What have you seen as, again, a common denominator where you've seen success, and maybe even an example of where you've successfully invested in circular economy?
To start with, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Novasta and what we do. So Novasta is a leading VC firm on the continent. So we make investments in transformational businesses across East Africa and West Africa. And I'd say we're one of the few investors that have made an investment, or one of the few VC investors who have made an investment in the circularity space. And circularity is one of those spaces where it's un-VC, I'd say. It takes a long time for these businesses to mature. It takes a lot of capital for these companies to get to the scale you want them to. And there have been very few exits in the space. So as an investor, as a VC investor, for example, you want to invest in a business and you want to exit at a certain point. And a lot of the VC funds have 10-year time horizons. And so if a business is going to take 15 years for it to mature, and then you won't realize your return on those investments. And for us, Synergy, we invested in Synergy because Synergy is one of the businesses in the circularity space, and I'd say probably one of the most successful here on the continent. They operate in Nairobi, where they collect organic waste from toilets that they've distributed across slums and informal settlements across Nairobi. So they have about 3,000 toilets that they've distributed across the city. So they collect that, take it to their processing facility, which is probably one of the largest waste recycling plant in Africa. And they convert that into other products, other useful products. This is organic fertilizer for farmers, as well as insect proteins that can be used for making animal feeds, as well as briquettes, which are used for firing up different aspects. And so they transform a lot of things that people consider waste into useful products, and that creates a business model that made us want to invest in the company. But this has not been without challenges, right? There are gaps in the space in terms of funding, and at the early stage, there's a lot of players, providing grants, technical assistance, and all that. But I think it's not enough, right? And when we come in as VC investors, we can support these businesses up to a certain point, but then you need growth stage investors who can now take the baton from you. And in our case, it took us almost 4 years, for example, to find someone else who could now come in and put in the growth equity investment into the business. And for some time, the business was stagnating because we could only support them up to a certain level. Up until probably last year is when they received funding from a few corporates and a few DFIs who were able to support the business to be able to get to the next stage, which was build a factory that enabled them to now generate significant revenues and attract debt capital, especially patient capital that enables them to get to the next stage of scaling this across Africa, for example, or to other cities which have similar problems to Nairobi. So I'd say, I think for this to work, I think there has to be, there are gaps in the funding ecosystem that needs to be filled. And I'd say it's more acute in the early stage as well as in the growth stage. And so for this to actually function, I think there needs to be, concerted efforts to make sure that, at all the stages, there needs to be players or support for players in those spaces to be able to provide that
Perfect.
Circularity in the funding ecosystem.
Thanks, Abel. So we'll open it up for 2 to 3 questions from the audience. If you have any questions, just raise up your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. So there's one question right there. And if you're able to direct it to any panel member so that we can answer that efficiently, or if it's all the panelists, that's okay as well.
Thank you. So that was such an interesting discussion there. My name is Catherine Weinberg. I'm the founder of Fotola. I come from South Africa, and we run 4 business accelerators. What we found is really interesting success in our youth accelerator, putting in small amounts of grant finance, where we've managed to take 100 ideation businesses and turn them within 6 months to be revenue generating, 50% of them to be revenue generating. And I believe that the transition point there is putting in small amounts of grant funding for people to be able to test and prove. But the other area that we have is we have a small fund, a circular fund, where we've raised a a cascade of funds in order to put money into businesses that are in a growth phase. Because I don't know if it's the same in the rest of Africa, but in South Africa, there's this huge gap in the kind of 250,000 to R1 million. No commercial players want to play in that market because it's a completely loss-making environment. And yet, in reality, if you're going to build circular businesses, that's where you need to be putting the money, not just looking for the occasional unicorn where you can drop in big VC funds. And so my question really is to Ada, is just I'm really interested in your model, and just wondering what ticket size worked, and what is how have you changed it? And maybe what are the ticket sizes that you're putting in, first in grant finance, and then if you are doing loan finance, just a little bit more detail about that would be really interesting. Thanks.
Perfect. Right, there's one hand at the back, right there.
Good morning, everyone. Indeed, a fascinating conversation. My name is Dr. Gamuchirai Mutezo, and I'm with ACBA, the African Circular Business Alliance. I'd like to complement my colleague's previous question and just add on to that. For all you panelists, right, if this room was filled with entrepreneurs, how best do they actually access information about the type of funding tools that you provide? Is it a matter of having to know you on a personal level, or are there platforms, yes, thank you for the giggle, or are there platforms where one can actually maximize on knowledge sharing? Because speaking as an entrepreneur in the past life, it's not until you get to spaces such as this that you actually know or learn about the funding mechanisms that are available, especially that early stage component, the grant availability. So I'm really, really keen to hear the type of insights and advice you can offer to aspiring circular economy businesses in terms of just accessing that grant or seed funding. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Should we take the two questions? I think one was for you, Ada, and then we can also talk about knowledge sharing platforms, right? The ones that you have or you probably think are the best that we can tap in. So maybe let's start with you, Ada.
Yes, so in terms of ticket sizes, generally AECF goes from $200K to 1.5 million. It's always matching grants, so you get what you can put in. We have seen, for instance, that to cater for the needs of more informal or semi-formal businesses or groups like cooperatives, for instance, or women saving groups, we needed to go to lower ticket sizes, and we do that through partnership with financial institutions. We capitalize MFIs, for instance, or we put a guarantee scheme there, and so that they can give zero interest rate loans for lower ticket sizes. Then I think most of the circular economy companies we funded were more in the 200K to 500K or 600K sizes, so more middle ticket sizes. It's also about what do we fund. We try to design our funding to act a bit as an equity investment into those companies so as to de-risk and really catalyze for commercial investors to come in. So we'll try to invest where there will not be a direct return from this investment. Of course, if the company absolutely needs inventory finance, it can also use it for that, and it's at the discrepancy of the company to use the money for what they need most. But we usually say, use our money to fund where you won't be able to recuperate your investments. So to develop your marketing, to develop your sales network, to build your staff capabilities, to recruit talent, to have your office set up, all these kind of starter costs that are going to take a long while to make a return, but that really equip you for market entry and build credibility to an investor that will be able to lend you for your working capital needs more easily then. And then to the second question, I think it's very much part of investors' responsibility to start very intentionally talking to each other, to promote a landscape that is much more digestible and understandable by normal human beings, because now it's just way too hectic and it's going in every direction. So I think it's really our responsibility to look at the whole financing cycle and say, this is the type of instruments available at this stage, and this is where you can get them, and it builds on to next type of financial instruments. So to increase the financial literacy, but also design instruments intentionally so that they meet the needs of the businesses at specific stages, and it's communicated in that way. So I think it's on us to be much more intentional communicators and work in partnership more strongly together.
Right. Jonathan, you had a quick remark?
Just to add to the points around platforms where you can get information, I think one of the things is also to harness, sectoral groups where you belong, right? So we can speak broadly around secular finance, from the perspective of where the funds are. But I also think information does rest, along your sectoral groups. So one of the things I try to advise is you might find or try to find a sectoral group that fits into the sector you play in. There are quite a couple of information that is there. And also don't look at financing purely from a institutional perspective. There also are various financing that do reside even within partnerships as well too. So you might find partners, you're trying to do something secular. It might obviously be connecting to a value chain to someone else's business as well. So I also think, communication and sectoral conversations can also help.
Okay. Any other platforms to add?
Yeah, I think as a VC investor, our job is to source for deals, right? And so we make ourselves available for startups to reach out, and that's why we attend events like this, or demo days, or pitch sessions. And so making yourself available in those sessions, I think, helps a lot. And also, just being in the networks that he talked about, where sometimes we get a lot of referrals from, let's say, accelerator programs or incubators or advisors in those spaces. And so being able to be in close contact with those people who can now refer you to investors is critical.
Okay. Yeah, maybe quickly on the ticket size. There are huge differences between different banks. So the NDBs, the National Development Banks. But often what we see is that the ticket size is too big. So that's why that you can also work at national level with intermediate financial parties who are playing the intermediate role and also are able to give them ticket sizes of much smaller amounts. So that on ticket size. On the platforms, the Commission, for example, the European Commission has set up, and that can be also repeated also in Africa at national level. So for Horizon 2020 projects, which are big projects, entrepreneurs who are interested to go into these kind of projects, they are proposed to follow courses. Or there are online sessions where they are informed about what are the application rules. So you can organize at national level online sessions for entrepreneurs, how to deal with it. I think it's also important that entrepreneurs are following courses about how to deal with business cases. So that they know much more about what does it mean to come with a financial feasible business case. I think this is really key.
Okay. All right. We're coming to the end of this segment, and I would like for you to take maybe a minute or two, to share a bit of your closing remarks and reflections. But I'll probably direct you in a couple of angles, right? So, Cohen, maybe let's start with you. Private sector inclusion, how do we achieve that? Let's start with you, Cohen.
So, can you repeat the question then?
The private sector inclusion, how do you make sure private sector is fully included?
But it's clear that in an African context, but only in Africa, is that if you really want to make this happening, that you have to involve the private sector as much as possible. To make the link to private to financial instruments, I don't think that we have to come with very difficult financial instruments. In my opinion, and I have a banking background, we have to make it as simple as possible. But we have to involve the private sector as much as possible because they have to make it happening. Yeah, so that means that we have to try to work together with the chambers of commerces in different countries, with the different sectors, to develop ideas and to try to understand what are they able to make happen and what not. Yeah. And from a financial point of view, I think there also the government can play an important role by giving guarantees. So they don't have to invest themselves, but if they are setting up certain instruments with the financial sector, that they can bring in the necessary guarantees. Because at the end of the story, and that's what we see in so many countries where we are active in Africa, the financial means have to come at the end of the story from the private sector.
Okay. Ada, I'll come to you next. Keeping in lenses, so inclusion lenses, so private sector inclusion. A lot of who you're talking about are startups and SMEs, mostly youth and women. So how do we think about the youth lens and the gender lens as we think about financing?
Yes, thank you. I think we have learned that we need to be very intentional in designing our financial instruments and mechanisms to mitigate the specific challenges that this type of entrepreneurs face, but also to complement it with business development support, technical assistance, or leadership programs. That's a lot of what we do with our women entrepreneurs. So when we curate, we might need to go smaller ticket sizes or design instruments that will give comfort to the men that their women can go on. Involving the men in gender-lens investing is very critical. So that might need to work through local community groups or local village leaders. We can't keep the men out of the story. And I think technical assistance, business development support is a prerequisite to then money, because money alone would not help much. In fact, it has been most of the failure cases we've seen when it doesn't come hand in hand with other things. The business is not fully equipped to thrive or succeed.
Perfect. Jonathan, I'll move to you. And we spoke about reporting and telling a story. What's your thought in terms of the implication on reporting, and where investors are asking us to report more, but many of our entrepreneurs are even not at that level? So what are those implications, and how do we shift that narrative?
Okay, I'll speak to it from two perspectives. So one will be for startups and those who haven't started business. So many of the reporting they'll be doing will be around projections, projections over time. My colleague spoke about patient capital. So in preparing financial reports, what obviously it has to tell a story, meaning it has to be, much more like a longer term reporting. So maybe like 5 to 7 year projections that can then tell when the revenues might then begin to come. But for me is, even though, these startups might want to tell a story of 5 to 7 years before the revenues start to show, I would like that it will be complemented with non-financials. So for example, how would their business do good for the society? How would their business do good for the environment? I think if you complement that with a financial projection that might show the long-term perspective as to where the revenues will come, I think that helps with your good story. Now, for those who are already in business, who are trying to grow, still the same thing, match or complement your financial reporting with non-financial reporting. I think the ESG lens is a very fantastic one, right? So, for example, governance is for me very strong. I have a use case in Nigeria where I speak to a lot of businesses, and they're doing circular innovations, but they're all registered as NGOs, right? And then you then find that it might be difficult to attract an investor because of the way your corporate governance and you're registered as not-for-profit, no potential to repatriate profits to those who might want to give you funding. So what I would say is, the financial reporting, even currently as at now, suffers some limitations for telling stories that do not have a financial value to them. So if you take, for instance, things around sharing of assets. So if you look at the way we report on assets, assets will be reported and then obviously matched with the annual depreciation that goes on those assets. But then again, the point is that you might even have assets that are fully depreciated and you call them waste, right? But those assets can also unlock more value for you, maybe through resale or perhaps even through recycling with the supply chain working together. So I think for me, the biggest thing around reporting for secular businesses is it must always be matched with non-financial reporting so that we then see a full story. So thanks to things like integrated reporting, where businesses now have a framework where we can then report on the totality of how value is created. So that's where I'll leave it at.
Perfect. And then closing out, Abel, I know you've spoken a bit about carbon credits here and there. And they can be controversial in one way or the other, particularly around circularity. But as we open up that space, even on the continent, what's your advice in terms of startups who want to get involved with carbon credits?
Yeah, I think circular economy startups need to start exploring alternative financing or funding sources, and also alternative sources of revenues that can help them, increase their profitability or make their unit economics work for them. And what I've seen in the space lately, probably in the last year or so, there's been emerging alternative funding or revenue sources, which includes carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and also plastic credits for plastic recycling companies. And and the process for getting accredited is very complicated, right? A lot of our local startups or local founders don't know how to go about the process of getting certified. And so what I've seen in the space is emergence of consultants, for example, and technical assistance facilities that can enable these companies to get accredited, and then they can now start selling those carbon credits to either corporates from obviously regionally or from abroad who can pay forward, and that can be a source of revenue and also source of funding for these companies to be able to scale their operations, become profitable, and in that sense attract, patient capital or lending, for example, to be able to do whatever they need to do to expand their operations in those countries they operate in.
All right, perfect. A round of applause to the panel. Thank you so much. I'll let you take your seats. This ends this segment, but we move into another short interlude where it will be a short video from the World Bank. Valerie Hickey, who's the World Bank Global Director for Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy. And she'll be talking about what the World Bank is doing in this space, particularly around de-risking and reducing risk or increasing the reward as well, as we think about how do we actually continue to catalyze investments in this space. So over to Valerie.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I wish I could be with you in person in Kigali for this very important discussion around catalyzing private investment and circular solutions across Africa. We're having this discussion at a very difficult time when hard-won development gains over the past 40 years are being eroded quickly. We have 30 million more people just in Africa alone who used to have access to electricity and today are living in the dark. 70 million more people who are living on less than $2.15 a day. That's catastrophic destitution. They simply can't put food in their bellies. The triple environmental crisis, of course, is exacerbating this, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss or pollution. And pollution is central to the discussion around circular economy. Moving towards a circular economy is not a nice to have, it's a must have. We're using 100 billion tons of raw materials every year. It's going to be double by 2050. 91% of that ends up in waste, in landfills, or just thrown out the door. We can't have that. That's why, again, circular economy is not a nice to have. It's a must have if we want green, resilient, and inclusive development. And it's a can have. And that's why this discussion around money is so important, because at the end of the day, the circular economy is all about efficiency, and efficiency is a money maker. Efficiency attracts private investment. The reason the circular economy isn't yet attracting private investment is because of uncertainty. It's uncertain policies, it's uncertain prices, it's uncertain technologies. Just think about virgin plastics versus recycled plastics. Recycled plastics are $72 a metric ton more expensive to produce than virgin plastic. That's the kind of uncertainty that is driving away private investment. And that's why at the World Bank we think de-risking is so important, and that's a role we want to play and we take very seriously. De-risking at the end of the day is all about either reducing risk or increasing rewards. We're increasing rewards for companies, for example, by co-investing in public infrastructure like we did through our private sector arm, the IFC in Mexico, with a $35 million loan to a recycling facility that helped create the post-consumer food-grade plastics for the soft drink bottling industry. It's also about reform and reducing risk by having rules of the game that make sense, are in place, and have institutions who can carry it out. We're doing that in places like Egypt, where, for example, we were able to reduce subsidies from over 6% of GDP to just over 3%, which really has spurred great innovation in the circular economy and waste management. So count on us to be a partner in de-risking. Count on us to make sure that we can realize the potential of the circular economy as a profit maker and the potential of the circular economy to deliver green, resilient, and inclusive development.
All right, thank you so much. Now, I'd like us to move to the last segment of our conversation this morning and quickly invite up Dora and Philip, with whom we'll take a bit of a moment to reflect around all the conversations we had this morning. We heard from Madame Aissa. We watched the GIZ video. Please have a sit. We listened to the 4 stellar panelists, and we have listened to Valerie. So it would be great for us to reflect upon some of your initial thoughts coming out of, or your takeaways, out of all the conversations we've had this morning, but equally, what is missing in those conversations that you have loved to hear? So maybe let's start with you, Dora. And Dora, by introduction, is a Senior Operations Officer at the Climate Investment Fund, and Philip Hon is the Head of Circular Economy at EIB. So welcome, panelists, and Dora, you can kick us off in terms of your reflections and probably what is missing in this conversation.
Thank you very much. It's quite a pleasure to be here and quite an honor to be providing contribution as a discussant to one of the core sections of this forum. I really like what Valerie said, that, of course, circular economy is not a matter of a nice to have, but it's more of a must have. And I also want to reflect on 1 or 2 things that were said by Deborah and Kisi yesterday, that in Africa, permit me to say, that circular economy is more ingrained in the lifestyle. Growing up in Ghana, it was quite normal for me to understand from my dad that working with a timber company, they grew their timber, they extracted through selective felling, then the byproduct from the processing of their timber actually served as the input material for their cogeneration plant on site. So even as a business, a regular business, they had this inbuilt circular economy, but we didn't call it so. Then, 15 years later, let's say that as a child being, influenced in my thinking around these topics, so it becomes also critical a point here that influencing the educational system, providing information for children to grasp some of these in their formative years become critical to informing their decision-making as adults. 15 years later, carried out an industrial ecology study, again, looking closely at the timber industry in Ghana. And I was quite pleased to learn that after a couple of years, this model was still working, that waste materials on site were being fed to generate energy. And an additional value here was some of the waste was actually fed into an on-site wood carving industry. So it seemed that the natural resources sector in Ghana was doing quite a pretty decent job of enhancing circularity. So let me now come back to now. I'm working with the Climate Investment Funds as a Senior Operations Officer. One key element of the Climate Investment Funds is one of the largest multilateral climate financing globally. And what we're doing is providing low-cost financing to some 72 countries to help push the agenda of low-carbon growth and climate resilient development. Quite pleased to mention that Rwanda is actually one of the bona fide beneficiaries of the CIF's investment in the areas of renewable energy, forest investment, and climate resilience. But why am I hinting on this? The key point here is that the Climate Investment Funds route its resources through the multilateral development banks. Here, the focus on banks. We're working with African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, EBRD, which is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IFC, and of course the World Bank. And so we route the resources through these banks in innovating and enhancing de-risking of private and public capital in the areas of renewable energy, sustainable forest management, and climate resilience. Owing to the increasing pressure, the CIFS is also pushing the agenda around renewable energy integration, clean technology, clean energy, accelerating coal transition, and also enhancing the uptake of nature-based solutions and climate mitigation and adaptation. Let me quickly reflect on one key example, which will help to address some of the pointers that came out of these conversations around access to finance and providing the enabling policy environment. The EBRD, as one of our implementing agencies, has supported the government of Turkey's private sector space. And what did they do? With their $200 million, they leveraged 20 million in highly concessional financing from the climate investment funds, and were able to establish the first of its kind business platform for promoting exchange of underutilized materials in the industrial sectors in the country. What is unique? This platform, owing to some of the pointers that have come out this morning, enabled the e-commerce space for exchange of materials, one, but most importantly, it really promoted the agenda around exchange of knowledge, exchange of best practices, exchange of challenges, which is really key to enhancing leapfrogging of experiences and practices, but most importantly, to ensuring that cross-fertilization. Also related to this, the platform, in addition to providing knowledge, enhanced the space for promoting one key point, which is enhancing the ability to address some of the policy gaps. So not only are you providing finance, and you're also filling the issues around the policy gaps. And it's worth noting that by virtue of bridging the gap between climate change and the circular economy, this project was actually able to achieve 5 times of its carbon emission reduction potential. So clearly, the climate investment funds business of working through banks is really reaping off. And within the CIF also, we have a dedicated private sector program that is also engendering climate enterprises, providing the space, the capacity building, the financing to break through some of the risky, what would have been called risky areas around climate action. Let me quickly say 1 or 2 quick things, and I'll pass it to you, Philip. But it's worth noting that around the room, we've learned so much about the youth role. The CIFs, in addition to promoting private sector, public-led investment in climate and circular economy-related interventions, is also at the COP26 launched its youth engagement strategy. And one of the key pillars is on youth entrepreneurship. And through that, we're partnering with the World Bank and with the African Development Bank through what we call the Youth Adapt program. Some really groundbreaking, innovative enterprises have been found. And for example, in Nigeria, plastics are feeding into shoe production. In Cameroon, youth are leading innovative technology for helping track disposal of plastic waste and converting that into recyclable materials. And then also, under the bank's Climate Smart Entrepreneurship Program, we identify some really innovative practices, such as in Liberia, Clean Cities Program is employing youth in collection, segregation, and recycling. And also, in Nigeria, one more interesting example, that waste is being used as a premium to support health insurance for low or impoverished communities. So within the aspect of providing finance, enabling the space for youth engagement, one key point that I also thought to reflect, and I'll pass it, Philip, is on these platforms are critical for exchange of knowledge. And I think, was it Abel who said that he uses these to scout? So I believe that collating the lessons and experiences and best practices and disseminating these allow that vertical and lateral knowledge exchange, knowledge learning is critical, but it's also essential that if circular economy is that must-have, why are we still having sport type excellence? Why isn't it super well mainstreamed? So I believe that these platforms are critical, but all elements around knowledge creation, knowledge exchange are also essential. So Philip, maybe for your thought-provoking question, and I'm taking it up for myself, we would want to hear from you on one issue around using programs like environmental performance rating, public disclosure, which could incorporate elements around circular economy. And in Ghana and Indonesia, there's the programs that are using these to incentivize cleaner production methods, say in the mining sector, in the oil palm industry, in the hotel industry. But I'll be keen to hear about IEB and how they are using similar methodologies or programs to further showcase and to further push the barriers on uptake on circular economy. Thank you.
Well done. I thought you had a question for me as well, but but we shall move to you, Philip. And thank you, Dora.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Dora, for this great introduction. Let me take the question to a higher level, to the question that is really in the room and that came out during all the panels we had yesterday already. The role of the financial sector, the role of the international financial institutions, the role of the MDBs in circular economy. We have heard yesterday already a number of nice examples from the African Development Bank. We just heard Valerie speaking about the World Bank. Allow me also to say some words about what the EIB is already doing in the sector. So, the EIB, as the EU Climate Bank, has a long-standing relation with Africa. We are supporting many, many projects, either alone or with partners, the African Development Bank and others. One of them is, for example, the COPIP project. The COPIP is a Clean Oceans Project Identification Program that is managed by my colleague Virgin Herbst, who is sitting here in the first row. It's about supporting feasibility studies for 10 waste management projects in sub-Saharan Africa in order to enable appropriate waste management, recycling, and avoid that the plastic is coming in the oceans. By coincidence, I heard our previous speaker, Karin Bosma, who's working on the TACA app project. So this is one of the 10 projects where the EIB is also looking into the pilot project, and certainly a good opportunity to explore this topic further. Karin also mentioned, small sidekick, the unnecessary plastic, which is a major challenge, and which also leads to my next point. Just to make the remark that the European Commission has 10 days ago published the draft of the new packaging directive, which explicitly addresses the non-necessary packaging. So I would expect that if this really goes through, we will have to deal with much less unnecessary packing in the future. Nonetheless, in the moment, recycling is an element that is very important, that is being supported, and where we need to do a lot of work in order to avoid the plastic coming into the ocean. But we also have the common understanding that circular economy is not an extension of waste management. It is about making best use of the resources. It is about reuse, reusability. It is about enabling the extension of life, and this is certainly also a challenge for the financial sector. It is a journey, a change for all of us, starting from the policy side, looking into governments, looking into the entrepreneurs who launch corresponding projects, and also for us from the financing side, because we are now facing completely different challenges than we did before. So the EIB has an annual lending volume of some 85 billion euros. And if we look into the financial needs that we have heard throughout this organization, then we are not able to respond individually to the financial needs of the corresponding beneficiaries. This is why we are looking into options like framework loans, sector-based lending to programs. But my takeaway from the two-day session here is that certainly we need to work further on that. We don't have yet the right answers to all the challenges that we are facing in the circular economy. However, this is something that we have in common with all the MDBs, and this is why also all the MDBs are talking together. So it's not only the MDB that is the EIB that is facing this challenge, but you remember that in Sharm el-Sheikh there was the IFI roadmap to circular economy presented. This exercise is ongoing, so already in January the MDBs will be sitting together again and look into how we can join our forces in order to support the transition to circular economy in the best way. This as a small introduction to what is already happening, and then particular to your question, we've heard about many initiatives. Of course, every initiative is highly welcome and highly supporting, but certainly in the future we need to ensure that we are working in a complementary way, that we are supporting each other, and therefore learning about who's doing what is extremely helpful. And it could also be helpful to consider the financial sector to be a partner in all the questions and challenges around circular economy.
Okay, perfect. So to close us out, probably a 1-minute call for action to the finance community, to the people in this room. What would be your 1-minute call of action to that community and the people in this room?
I'm tempted to say that in view that there are quite a number of best practices and working lessons, replicable experiences spanning different countries on the continent, clearly continued space for knowledge exchange, cross-fertilization, that whole space of leapfrogging, de-risking or demystifying the intricacies and complexities around circular economy. And as if I may also pick what you said, Philip, that enabling that space for collaboration of efforts, harmonization of effort between the multilateral development banks becomes a critical part of this journey. And coming from the climate investment funds, by virtue that we work with these 6 multilateral development banks, give us that pivotal role in enhancing that space for lateral exchange of knowledge and experiences across MDBs, but most importantly, ensuring that this knowledge reaches the wider audience. And of course, within the CIF, we have a key evaluation and learning initiative within our business that provides the space for continued collation of messages, knowledge and experience, and for further dissemination of these. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Philip, your call to action?
It was impressive to feel the positive energy in this room that all unites us in driving towards a more circular world, because it is the better world. It's the only opportunity for human mankind and the planet to survive. So we have a strong common motivation to go ahead. And I would say that the financial sector needs to be an integral part of that. I think the financial sector has understood this message, and I would be very happy if we could dedicate some time at the next World Circular Economy Forum to the role of the financial sector in the transition to circular economy.
Perfect. So as we bring this to a close, I'm definitely hearing quite a lot of funding opportunities exist, a lot of pockets of excellence at this point in time. But we need to coordinate those better. We need to get people in the room. We need to work better. And I think the meetings that are happening are starting to get us there. I'm definitely hearing, even from the panelists, that we need to think about moving beyond grants, so blended financing that also builds in elements of de-risking and, as Valerie was saying, even increasing reward as well. And again, I think the appreciation that it will be a journey. So how are we invested to walk the journey with circular entrepreneurs? But I think from the entrepreneurs, or for the entrepreneurs, they definitely need information, because you could hear that they probably know a bit, but where can they actually get more information? But equally, as they access this information, as they come before funding opportunities, how do they tell their stories better, that are more data-driven, and they're able to make the case for financing as well? Sorry, Philip.
Yes, I would like to jump in there, because in the end, the entrepreneurs who drive circular economy forward must gain something out of that.
Okay.
There must be profit. And without this profit, the corresponding projects will not happen. So without the corresponding projects, there's nothing that the MDBs can finance. So therefore, it is absolutely essential that the regulatory framework and the incentives are set in order to allow the entrepreneurs to develop their business.
Perfect. So with that, I'd like to thank Madame Isa for the opening remarks that you gave us as we opened the session. I would like to thank the GIZ team for the fantastic video that was put together as well. Our panel, which had Abel, Jonathan, Cohen, Ada, thank you so much for the stellar remarks that you provided to us. To Valerie, who joined us by video from the World Bank, and again to our closing panel that helps us reflect and bring this all together. Dora, thank you so much for your sharp remarks, and Philip, thank you so much for your wisdom and guidance. With that, I thank you all for attending this session. Hope it was helpful, and back to you, Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you, and another round of applause. I think Steve did an excellent job. at moderating this session. What really stood out for me in terms of the conversations that we had was the importance of knowledge sharing, and in particular knowledge sharing in terms of providing the knowledge to the startups, to the businesses involved in the circular economy as to where they can actually access private financing as well as public financing, and vice versa, for the creation of pipeline for those companies that are looking to invest from early stage all the way through to growth stage financing. What I also remember and took note of was the importance of matching the right funding mechanisms to the right companies. And in the last discussions as well is the commitments from the private sector, as well as we heard of quite a few projects and initiatives coming from the public sector in ensuring that we receive the right financing for the circular economy. Now, of course, again, we'd like to remind you of the accelerator sessions that will be taking place tomorrow. There's quite a few that have probably sparked your interest already, but just as an announcement, so there is a reminder for the ASIN Foundation Accelerator session. So that's going to be taking place in Norsken. Now, they have told us that there is a lunch that is also going to take place during that accelerator session, and that the final deadline to be able to register for that is approaching in the next couple of minutes. So make sure that you register to that so that they can make the necessary provisions for that lunch. Now, speaking of lunch, we are going to be having ours. So what we'd like to remind you is that there is 2 lunches taking place. Those of you that have a yellow card will be making your way downstairs, and everybody else will be making your way to the Soko room in the foyer, which is 1 floor down over to where the breakfast area was here at the Marriott. We would like you to make sure that you enjoy your lunch, but do come back for the rest of the afternoon. 1:40 sharp is the time that we will be continuing today's session. And that session will be From Africa for a Circular Future. And I can guarantee you that you will not want to miss out on that. So please do enjoy lunch, and the conversation continues in person, online, and in the studios. Make sure to use the hashtag WCEF2022 to join into the 6th forum of the World Circular Economy Forum. Enjoy the lunch, and thank you.